Bem-vindos ao podcast What Drives You. Aqui exploramos histórias, estratégias e ferramentas das pessoas que têm bem claro o que as move. Por isso, se queres ser uma delas, mantém-te por aí, porque a jornada vai começar. Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of the What Drives You podcast, and today I want to share with you a very special conversation I had a couple of weeks ago with Ryan Rumsey. Ryan is the founder of the Second Wave Dive, a company that focuses on giving leaders the tools they need to change how decisions are made. They have courses, coaching and consulting for the new wave of leadership. He's also the author of Business Thinking for Designers. And in this conversation, we talk about his journey, pursuing different jobs and interests, as well as his work in Second Wave Dive and a lot more. I really love talking with Ryan, and I think you must follow his work. You can read his book for free and subscribe the Second Wave Dive newsletter in the link in the description. Before you go, a word of thank you to our amazing sponsors, Geração S+, a project built to give youngsters the healthy lifestyle they need today in order to become happier adults tomorrow. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Ryan Rumsey. Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of the What Drives You podcast, and today I have Ryan Rumsey with me. Ryan, thank you so much for doing this. It's really a pleasure. And I want to start with 3 quick questions. Is that okay for you?
Yes, of course. Thanks for having me.
No, that's okay. First one, who's your favorite Liverpool FC player and why?
Okay, so it's an easy one. I grew up in the era of Steven Gerrard, number 8, captain, fantastic.
Yeah.
So this was really, I of course started watching Liverpool earlier, but for me, Steven Gerrard, the midfield, and every one of my children have a number 8
really?
kit, or we passed it down when they get too big. And number 8 is what we share.
That's really good. So the second one is, how often do you watch Stein's music video Fake? Having some connection.
So for those of you who don't know, 20-something years ago, I was an actor, and I was the lead actor in the music video for Stein, the band Stein, their song called Fade. Maybe like once or twice a year when somebody asks me, I share the link. I don't go back and watch it.
It was actually, and let me just tell you this story, because I was doing some research, and you have that on your website. And when I saw the video, then I actually recall watching that video when I was younger on television. So it was like this mind-blowing moment, like thinking, oh my god, I'm going to interview that guy, amazing. And this actually will be one small victory for me that I will share with my friends that like rock as well. Like, you see that guy, I interviewed him.
It's so embarrassing now I think about it. I mean, it was fun, but it's kind of embarrassing that that's still there.
I get it. So the third one is, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but you had some kind of toy in your desk when you worked at Apple. Is that true? And if so, what did it symbolize to you?
Could you repeat the question? What did I have at Apple?
So while I was doing this research, I saw a picture and from your desk, I think at Apple, and you had this small toy on top.
Okay. Oh yes. So that is Captain Distracto. So the clay little figure is my nickname from my wife. So I have ADHD, which means part of this is, I don't always stay on topic, or I jump from topic to topic. And so that little figure was made of clay, modeling clay, that I made for myself while visiting I think it's called so it's in San Francisco. It's like the Children's Museum of Art. It's very interactive. And so I made that figure, but the figure is called Captain Distracto. And so this is like the little family nickname that my wife has for me. It doesn't really call me that anymore. You know, 20 years ago ish. That's what.
Okay, beautiful. So You had a lot of jobs: construction, customer support, working on a farm, acting. Were there any lessons you've learned on those jobs that are still relevant to you in today?
Oh, goodness. Yes. I think, the backstory goes to when I turned 14, my father said, Happy birthday. Go get your working papers. So this was at the time the legal age to start working. And, I wanted to work, but it was also what an experience to like go and get a paycheck. And so my first job was working on a farm, not with animals, but growing plants and selling fruits and vegetables during the summers. And starting at 14 during the summer, I would work 6 days a week, like 8:30 to 6 every day, or 6 days a week. And I got paid something like $2.13 an hour, and I got paid in cash. But then I had to do my own taxes. And so the lessons that I think stick with me throughout all these jobs is to embrace these new opportunities. And then for me, I think now that I'm 47, I've built sort of this rhythm, I guess, of like remixing, of taking what worked in one job and seeing if I could apply it here. So what does, planting little plants for 8 hours a day, what does that have to do with the logistics of doing something in my days now? And so I had all sorts of interesting things. I could say like maybe all of them were not great. Some of the jobs were not fun, but sort of like going through high school, I'm glad that I did that, and I don't necessarily want to do that again, but I could take those lessons and apply it. Okay. And so working that much as a teenager taught me, I think taught me the benefit of trying something new, certainly delegating. That job had two bosses, a father and a son.
Oh, okay.
And they both wanted the job to be done two different ways. And so like at 14, I had to learn, when the father is there, I do it this way. But when the son is there, I change and I do it this way. And it was like, how do I sort of be aware of those things, around?
That's a beautiful answer. So I want to get how did you end up on design, but I wanted to share with a quote with you and ask you to tell me what it means to you. Is that okay?
Of course, yes.
Yeah, so the quote is this: your mother is the way she is because your mother is the way she is. Can you please talk about this quote?
Wow, you've done some research. So I gave a talk a few years ago, which was a Creative Mornings talk while living in Switzerland. So this was Creative Mornings Geneva. And the quote is related to sort of the behaviors that maybe we don't see or sort of realize with the people that are closest to us. So I think for many people, and it's not related to my mom, it's just a quote. But it's saying that we see a lot of, especially like with family members or people that we work with, they kind of behave the same way every day. So, your parent is always talking to you or always instructing you in a certain way. And we want them to behave differently every day. Like, why can't they just behave a different way? And so the quote is like, what if they don't? How will you continue to, how will you progress? And so related to work, if we see a colleague like not valuing us or making decisions in a certain way, maybe that's just the pattern that we need to say, okay, so how do we work anyway if they always behave that way? How do we, be okay with ourselves? How do we adjust our approach if that's just the way they behave? And I think,
I really like that quote because yesterday it was funny because yesterday I was doing the research for the podcast. I've been doing it for the past week, but yesterday I was looking at some of your talks
And I was actually I did it because I was having trouble with someone at work at our own team, and so I started watching your talk at Creative Mornings, and you came up with this quote, and I thought, damn, I needed to hear that, because that's true. People around us, sometimes they'll behave in certain patterns, and you must adapt in order to be free and to be more happy, right? So
yeah. And it's not fun. It's not hard. It's so much easier if they would just behave a different way. And I think too is the same when, for you know, I talk to a lot of people who become managers for the first time, or now they lead teams, and it's so much easier to work with people who just maybe are like us, you know, and they are curious and they want to learn. And then there's people who maybe aren't so curious. And so it's really hard then. It's not the easiest thing to do. And so the quote is really around like, how do we get more comfortable with maybe the reality that is behavior that exists. And I want to be careful too, that there are a lot of behaviors that are not good behaviors. Toxic, dangerous behaviors. But it's more around, you know, like the quote goes to like, my mom is always yelling at me. I want her to stop yelling at me. But that doesn't change. Like, right. So if I assume that she was always going to yell, how can I then be more comfortable?
Of course. So let's get into design. And here I have two main questions. The first one is, how did you end up doing design for a living?
That's a complicated answer, because I maybe I'll go back to like university.
Go ahead.
So when I was in high school preparing for university, I was both pretty good at math, but pretty good at art. And so I was developing like my art portfolio while also, you know, in college level math classes. And so I really wanted to be an architect. I really wanted to combine those. And at the time, you know, the landscape for architects, like the business environment, was not good. You know, this was like 1987. I'm pretty old. 1988, and I got some guidance that said, like, you know, being an architect might be a really difficult life. Maybe you should not do that. And I was naive and like, oh, okay. So I went to school to be a material science engineer, and I hated it. My first class, like 8 a.m. on Monday, was Fortran. And I was like, oh, this is terrible. Like, why would anybody do this? But I also started university in 1992. And very soon, the web was a thing. And so while I was going to class and studying math and physics and chemistry and all these things, I would go home and, what's this HTML thing? And I had like my bootlegged version of Photoshop, and I was making, you know, posters and graphics for friends. And so it took me a long time to sort of like connect, well, that's my passion. So at nights I was still making things, and through all the 90s I was just playing around with HTML and Photoshop and making things. And it was all an accident. You know, my first job out of university, I worked for a trance record label, like setting up club events and like scheduling, you know, big artists in Ibiza and New York and Las Vegas.
Awesome.
And then the company went under, and so I had to have a new job, and I was like, I don't know what to do. And so I was making web things at night, but I never thought it was a real job. So I became an actor, and I was acting during the day and then making web things at night. And it wasn't until I met my wife, and I was like, I don't want to work every day. I don't want to hustle 7 days a week. I want my weekends off. This is somebody that I want to spend time with. And so then I luckily had a friend who was working for a company that they needed a designer, but they needed somebody. So I was called a web producer at the time because I knew how to code, but I also knew how to design. And so they brought me in, and so began the journey of like full-time design stuff, that's how I got into it.
So you have this amazing journey in design. You work at some big companies, and I wanted to ask you precisely, what was it like to work at Apple and Electronic Arts?
So it was very different. The thing with Apple, I got very lucky so it was just timing. I was living in Los Angeles, working for the TV channel E Entertainment, which was really owned by Comcast. And I was not making websites, but building like intranets and extranets, building all these like internal tools that a lot of people, like portals and things like this way back then. And so not a lot of people did that. But when my wife and I got married, we got married outside of Los Angeles, but we returned and we just looked at each other and we said, we need to leave. We don't want to be here. So I put my resume on a website called dice.com. So it was like where all the engineers put their, developers put their resume, because I was like this weird. And Apple called me 3 days later. And suddenly I was, in Austin 10 days after my wedding, like weird. And I felt very intimidated. I was like, they must have the wrong person. I am not like an Apple, like a designer, but they needed these types of tools that I was familiar with. And so what was great about working at Apple was I got to work for Apple Care, which was customer support, but I built large-scale web applications, not websites. Really quite early, before people began moving from, say, native applications to web applications. And so we were doing things like responsive design, but in large-scale web applications in the browser, like 2 years before.
That was
before it was a thing, and so it was a weird combination of like using, so I was a developer, I was a designer, I was a research, kind of everything. And what Apple taught me was like how to embrace like the idea of data and using data to inform a lot of the decisions, but not just qual, but quant. And so I didn't work in Steve Jobs kind of realm. I worked for Tim Cook, because Tim Cook was the CFO at the time. And so AppleCare was all driven around metrics and data. So I got to learn about statistical relevance as it relates to the metrics, and benchmarking and setting up scorecards, but all as a means to kind of inform how I talked about design to, the accounting team or the team that needed a budget, or was permission budget. And then working at Electronic Arts, it was totally different. So it was like, oh my gosh, I get to work with video games? That's cool. But I didn't work in video games. I worked in customer experience. And so then coming into this environment where they weren't so much driven by like data, but driven really more by like that ethereal experience of playing a game and using game theory to incorporate that into like internal tools, So there was lots of really cool things of like, ooh, if we're talking about building tools for customer support agents, what if we could level them up like a gamer? What if they saw that their application changed because they leveled up? And what if we had kind of player cards to sort of show that they're going out and learning new skills? And so it was really fun, but also very different from Apple. So I had to learn like, oh, what happens when they're not data driven? How do I learn this? And I got to build a team for the first time. So both of those were exciting and hard in very different ways. And I think that they were kind of polar opposites. And so by having that exposure, it really helped me kind of go like, oh my gosh, design is way more complicated. Is perceived in entirely different ways than I thought it was.
So that was actually one of the things that I liked the most while doing some research for this interview, is that you have this, I understood with you that design is way much more than what I thought design was. And especially reading your book, which, by the way, called Business Thinking for Designers. And if you if you allow me, it has actually some really good strategies for people that are like me, have nothing to do with design. And actually, before I go to the book, let me just rewind a little bit and ask you something, which is you have this beautiful idea, and I really liked it, that design can work as a way for you to find the core purpose. And I wanted to ask you to elaborate a little bit on that. What do you mean by this core purpose?
Well, I think design is if we think about design as the problem-solving process, right? The approach there for me is then saying that design technique and methodology can help us find what is our core purpose. And it also can expose that maybe some businesses, their core purpose is just to make money, right? But what I think design provides for us is a way to kind of cut through and make sense of, like, are we really prioritizing, a customer thing, a human thing over stakeholder, over profits, right? And design for us can really help see that some of the words that we use of, like, we're this, but then the decisions being made are very different from what is being said. And so for me, design is an approach to identify core purpose. And I think as I've grown, what it has also done is me using the methodology to see if the organization I am working for or with maybe matches my values. Their values match my values. And so then it's like, does the core purpose of what they really want to do match up with the core purpose of maybe what I want to contribute to, what I want to support? So that's kind of what I mean of using design to help us identify core purpose.
And that's a great answer. So let's go back to the book. And I know we have little time, so because here's the thing, the book, it's a small book and it's really good. I really enjoyed it. So there's a lot of questions I would like to answer about the book, but I reduced them to two. So the first one is, what were the one thing that you actually not the one thing, but throughout all the book, what are the main lessons that you believe or that you actually so let me rephrase it. You wrote this book with all these amazing strategies and different ways of approaching both design and business, and if you had to come down to 2-3 main things that you wish that people after reading the book they understood, what would those things be?
Okay, yeah. So I think going back to the reason for writing the book was I was seeing that a lot of decisions being made were not necessarily like what we would call business decisions or data-driven decisions. Like a lot of, I think what we are told is that, get an MBA and, or use data or use math and everything is fine. But I think one of the core things is that we're talking about a lot of decisions that we make with our colleagues are more around relationships. They're around how we understand each other. And so there's language and communication. So the first one I would say is, if we really look at how decisions are made, the majority of them, I think, are around how we relate to people and how we communicate with people. So that leads us to the second one, is that designers are actually positioned really well, where our backgrounds in understanding how people interact with information, an understanding of why they may adopt something and incorporate it into their lives. Well, that background gives us a great opportunity to actually see, like, oh, how can I relate to my colleague in a way? And then the third lesson, I think, is there are lots of other frameworks. There are lots of other mechanisms that are out there that we didn't know about, that we were never exposed to. But I also think active practicing of these other things is required for us to kind of feel comfortable in using some of the techniques. So the book is more like, there are other ways. You are closer than you think. We may have to get a little comfortable with some of the things that we may be uncomfortable with. Yeah. We talk about math being important. We're not necessarily responsible for the math. We don't have to actively do the math. Yeah. But we should be more aware if somebody is doing that. Yeah. Because if nobody's doing that, then we know that it's not a data problem. It might be more of a relationship problem. Types of things. So the book was all around that. And I think why I wrote it was a lot of the guidance that I was seeing or given sort of within the industry was great, but it was coming from people who didn't have my responsibilities, didn't have to live with the guidance that was provided. And so in my roles, I not only had to provide the guidance, I then had to be responsible for seeing it acted out and seeing it come into play and executed, and then tracking it and monitoring it and determining if it was working or not. And I think through that is that lived experience of saying, like, well, it's right. It's a lot of work. And so I'm just trying to make, the book was there to say, like, there are other ways we can make it very pragmatic and applicable.
That's a beautiful way to write a book. So there was this one thing that from all of it, there was this one diagram, and maybe it's a little bit weird, but I really liked it. And there you presented this Venn diagram where business, engineering, and design combined would lead to innovation. So can you explain us why that is? Why do you believe that those three components lead to innovation?
So if the Venn diagram is actually, that's not my Venn diagram. That comes from like the design thinking world, right? That all you need is business and design and engineering and magic innovation happens. But in the reality, we know that that's not the case. And what's also confusing for me about that diagram is business and engineering are like departments. Mostly people perceive them as like departments. But design, is it the department, or is it the method? Is it the function? Like, what is it? But when we think about what really innovation and what like an executive team or what a leadership team or somebody who's running a company wants, is they don't want innovation. They want to create some type of competitive advantage in the market that allows them to be successful, like allows them to generate profit, so that they can pay their employees, so that they can, do well. And that shift then is then like, well, if you're talking about competitive advantage and having some way to be successful, then we're really talking about viability and feasibility and desirability. And so I wanted to talk more about, like, let's then dig into what those things mean. Because I think if you talk to any business person or any engineer about, like, we need things that are desirable, they'll agree. But if you talk to them about we need design, they might not agree. Right?
That's the other Venn diagram that you proposed after presenting that one with those three elements. It's really good. So let me. I want to talk a little bit about second wave dive before we run out of time.
Sure.
So you have founded that company where you teach some courses and do some coaching and tell us, what do you guys do? What's the core purpose of the company, and what do you do that's different?
So our difference is probably who we focus on. We've, when I set up the company, it was me thinking that mid-career professionals, when I say mid-career, maybe after your first 1 or 3 years, we don't get a lot of active mentorship We don't get a lot of like instructional design. If you become a manager for the first time, if you become a director, if you become an executive, there is not a lot of active mentorship or even practice of new things. And yet we're hired into these roles. We don't know a lot of the skills that are involved there. And then we're expected to immediately know how to do these things. And so this was a pain for me growing, through my career, of saying like, oh, I thought when I reached this level that I would get, active mentorship at this level. Like the first time I became a director, I was like, surely now somebody will help me become a good director, right? And the first time I became an executive, surely somebody will tell me how to become a better executive. Those things didn't happen. And so our focus then is to say, with mid-career professionals, we believe the hardest problem to solve is changing how organizations make decisions. And so what we want to do is provide intentional, deliberate practice into things that are, unfamiliar to us, in a place, in a space where you're not going to feel embarrassment or, fear of reprisal from a colleague. Like you don't want to try something for the first time in front of your CEO.
Yeah, of course.
You want to practice that. So this is what our courses and community is all about. Like, how do we actively practice new skills before we go do it in real life? And so the last thing is to say everything should be applicable on Monday. Rather than just sharing 3 bullet points and say, you need to be an active listener. We will take you through exercises of saying like, here's a dialogue script that comes from relationship theory, which shows you how to practice active listening, but also shows you how you can then turn that into a small request. And so that's what Second Wave Dive is about. It's really about giving opportunity to mid-career professionals to have some space away from their day-to-day to practice new skills with peers that are like them, so that everybody kind of gets a faster path, to some relief, if you will.
And one of the things that I really loved about that idea was precisely what you said, that every skill must be applicable on Monday, and I really like that. So I was wondering, was that a decision that you made as soon as you started the company? So we're going to approach things this way, or?
That's a decision that I made many, many years ago.
Oh, okay.
So I don't talk about it a lot, but I have had these notes and this idea for maybe 8 years.
Oh, okay.
I just didn't do anything with them. And so where it was frustrating for me was probably when I moved from Apple to Electronic Arts, is that a lot of the guidance that I was given was wonderfully inspirational. Like, you need principles, you need this. And I was like, ooh, that's inspiring. But then I had no way of how to apply that. Like pragmatically, there was no lesson. And so for me, right away, in all the work that I was doing, was how do I take this and how do I apply it? How do I make it pragmatic? And I think the key for me was I had a member of my team, I think in about 2015, 2016, where they saw me in a meeting with executives and showing how to use like scorecard and objectives and metrics in a very different way, and like drive decisions in a different way. And after the meeting, that member came up to the member of my team came up to me, and she said, I can see what you're doing. I have no idea how you got to that point. How did you get here? How did you do that? And so I said, oh my gosh, it's not a matter of me showing. I actually have to teach these things so that people can discover their own paths. How do I turn some of these lessons into more of instructional moments? And that's very different than just showing, here's how you do it.
Yeah.
Right. And so for me, that's a big part of our difference with second wave dive is not here's an example of somebody who did this.
Yeah.
It's more like, here's the situation that was present. They were working with people who didn't trust them. They had no budget. They were under some type of pressure to meet a deadline in 90. How then did they do that? Well, they had to get very pragmatic and showing through those lines. Right. How? Right. Because we all, when we want to learn, we want to be able to act and be able to come back to our real life and say, oh, I have a way to maybe not be stuck or break from the status quo.
Yeah, I mean, I always like to promote projects that use that idea, almost like skill-based learning, right? Where you must put into practice that's really good. So I have only 2 more questions, Ryan.
Cool.
The first one is, you have this great, amazing Twitter thread about leaders or managers or about actually getting into a position of leadership and what in some functions that seem pretty easy on paper, but actually in real life, those are not that easy to do. Things like teaching others what you know, or and this one really struck a chord on me, sharing the vision, but sharing enough of the vision, but not sharing too much. So I was wondering if you have any tips or strategies, simple strategies that we can use in order to solve these issues.
So for me, I think I wish there was an easy answer, but I think in the reality is it all depends on the people that I'm relating with. You know, even on a team, I think one of the first lessons that I had to learn was that there were some people who were curious and they were, wanted to know. So they would ask why from that curious, they wanted to figure it out. But then there were other people who asked why because they didn't want to do something different. Right. And so then sharing enough is we have to remember that an important part of being in service to organizations is that we're in service to the people that we work with at a peer level or even our bosses, and then we're in service to the people that work for us, like we are in service. And so we have to understand that morale and motivation are different things. We have to boost the morale of a team, but then keep individuals motivated. And when you talk about individuals are motivated in different ways,
of course.
But then we need to maintain the morale, or if the one person on the team is so demotivated that it affects the morale of the team, what do we prioritize, right? So it's kind of getting into that nuance of saying it's hard, right? It's difficult. And I think for me, that has been more about my own, me going to therapy and understanding where I begin and end as an individual, and getting some support from me. And that's something that I've been awfully privileged to get to be able to handle. But to me, I wish there was one answer. Here's the quick tip. But it's more like understanding that I think that individual motivation is different, but we're also responsible for the morale of the team.
Yeah, that's a great framework. The morale motivation thing. It actually makes a lot of sense. So Ryan, I just have one more question, and we go. But let me just ask you something before, which is, if people want to connect with you, what is the best place to do it?
So 2 easy ways. On social media, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, you could find me Ryan Rumsey at Ryan Rumsey. So it's the same there. If you're interested in the coursework and the communities that we build, or these types of things, it's all at Second Wave Dive. And so I would say mostly you hear my voice through Ryan Rumsey. Second Wave Dive is more around trying to share more about our alumni and the community and how people are learning there. There are some tips that we share there, but mostly Ryan Rumsey is where you'll maybe see me having particular threads like the one you read.
So I'll leave the links in the description, and I advise everyone to actually subscribe to your newsletter at the Second Wave Dive, because that's a really good newsletter as well. So Ryan, thank you so much for doing this. My last question is actually the question that gives name to the podcast, and that is, what drives you?
What drives me is balance these days. My family is the most important part, and maybe 10 years ago I would say that, but not always balance that.
Yeah.
And so for me, what drives me is maintaining balance, and that every day at 5 o'clock, these things go away. I do my best to put these away, ensure that I have balance between what I do to make a living, but what I really do, which is to be a decent partner and a decent parent, and a decent friend and a decent community member, and all those types of things.
That's a beautiful answer. Ryan, thank you so much for doing this. It was really a great pleasure. And to everyone watching, you can follow Ryan. We'll leave the links in the description, as well. Leave a rating in your favorite podcast app. Ryan, once again, thank you so much, and to everyone, I'll see you soon.
Thanks so much for having me.